Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Jemima Abu, and today I'm going to be talking to you about accessible JavaScript. And this very interesting position is because I could not figure out where I had good lighting in the room I'm staying in. So this is fine. Anyway, I'm Jemima. I am a self-taught front-end developer and school-taught systems engineer from Lagos, Nigeria, currently working at Telesoftis in Lithuania. You can find me online anywhere at Jemima Abu. So let's get right into it. What is accessibility? Accessibility is the practice of building products that everyone can use. So now I say this because it's kind of like the most basic definition. And when you hear that, you would think, well, duh, what's the point of building a product that people can't use? But that is the fact. When you have an wow. When you have an inaccessible website, sometimes your brain says a word and your mouth is running. When you have an inaccessible website, it means that not everyone can use that site. Not everyone can go to your site and see things on it. So that's basically building a useless product. If you build a site that is not accessible, it is useless to some people. Ergo, it's kind of useless to everyone. So accessibility comes in different forms. And the problem whenever people are building sites is that you don't think about all the ways people are going to access your site. You're building a site and you're seeing it the way you see it. You're like, okay, this looks good. It's responsive. I can see the colors. But there are people who rely on screen readers who can't see things that you have placed because you put them somewhere off the screen and you did not put a proper tag that is telling a screen reader where that thing should go. There are people who don't hear, for example. There are people who are deaf and they can't hear the videos you put on your site, and you don't have any captions available, so people can't see these things, can't hear these things, because that's what it is. Basically, the point is there are a lot of factors in place for how accessibility works. There are people who are browsing with slow internet, or people who are 102, or people who are standing in direct sunlight. All of these things are factors you have to put in place when you're building your site, because that is what accessibility is. Accessibility is building products that everyone can use regardless of their abilities. I hope that clears that up. Now, why is accessibility important? To be fair, it does sound kind of obvious after hearing that, so people can use it, but there are also like actual legal and business reasons behind why you want to make sure your site is accessible. The first reason, and I would say the most important reason, is just because it's kind of the right thing to do. It's kind of like a decency thing. Like, don't make a site that people can't use. The web is for everyone, so everyone should be able to use it. When you build your site, make sure that it's usable by everyone. But also because it's the law. There is a 2016 EU Web Accessibility Directive that states that public sectors have to ensure that their sites are accessible by making them perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. These are the accessibility guidelines by the WCAG. And if you are in breach of this law, this is a different law, but still has the same. This is a different body than the first law. This is for the UK. The first one was for the EU. And in the UK, if you do not make sure your sites are accessible, you are open to lawsuits. Basically, people could sue you for having an accessible website, and there have been previous cases, much higher cases, of people actually getting lawsuits over their sites. So on the one hand, it's the right thing to do, but on the other hand, you don't want a huge lawsuit on your hands. So kind of make sure your sites are accessible. So now the title of this talk was Accessible JavaScript. So what is accessibility with relation to JavaScript? The thing is, a lot of times we start talking about accessibility, we usually focus on HTML, make sure you have semantic elements, or focus on CSS, make sure your text and your background have appropriate contrast. But there are some areas where JavaScript also helps with your accessibility, and we're going to look at some of them. So how can we use JavaScript to improve the accessibility of the site? A web page containing JavaScript is accessible if the functionality of the site is device independent. What that means is if you have certain scripts on your site, those scripts should be able to run regardless of how people are navigating through that site, whether they're using their keyboard or they're using a mouse or they're using a pointer or they're using a scrolling thing on their phone. People should be able to access your sites regardless. And the information is available to assistive technologies. What this means is that you should not be preventing assistive technologies like screen readers, for example, from being able to view the information on your site because you are rendering them in a way that isn't accessible. So yeah, that's about it for how JavaScript relates to accessibility. So what we're going to go into now is how we can actually write accessible JavaScript code. How can you write your code in JavaScript to make sure that it's accessible? Writing accessible JavaScript. So firstly, we have the area of content. So when you want to display content, I feel like this is something that we do a lot in JavaScript or in like a React application or whatever. You have like hidden content and there's a button people can click to display more content, and then it toggles the display basically. But how do you make sure that this content you're displaying is available to screen readers? If a screen reader comes to a page and they don't see a content on the page, you're not going to read it out. So how do you ensure that the screen reader can see this content once you have updated the page? You can do that by ensuring that you always include your ARIA attributes within the content that you're displaying. So for example, this is a very basic JavaScript code to toggle an element basically. So, if your button's inner text is show, then remove the hidden class list. And then, so these like couple of the first 3 lines, they're probably like very common, like you would do this a lot, but then what people forget is that even when you're changing the display of things, you also need to change the attributes of things. You need to change the roles, the ARIA roles that are given to these things to make sure that your screen readers are able to navigate them usefully. So when you're setting your ARIA heading to false, that is letting the screen reader know that this thing can no longer be displayed on the page. When you set it to true, that's letting the screen reader know that this content is now on the page. So hopefully that makes sense. Another thing we can have is timed content. This in a case where, honestly, like I could not think of a case where somebody would want to time something on their site because it just seems kind of odd. Like imagine going to Wikipedia and they're like, this article will disappear in 30 minutes, so hurry up. Yeah, but it's possible though. It is possible that sometimes you want to display content for a certain period of time and then remove it. So how do you make sure that screen readers are able to detect when this content has been updated and removed, basically? The ARIA role for that is the ARIA live role. So an ARIA live role is basically like, think of it as you're like adding an event listener to the content you just added to your web page. When you add your ARIA live role, it's letting a screen reader know that this content is live. So you can have your ARIA live equals to off. What that means is that the screen reader is not going to be detecting constant changes on it. You can also have your ARIA live equals to polite. So polite is basically saying that wait until you're done reading the first whatever content comes before this thing and then read the next one. And then you can have your ARIA live to be assertive. So that is like, don't finish reading anything else, just read this one and read the updates from this one. So this is how you would make sure that your content that you're constantly updating is live on the page. So now how would we include this in JavaScript, for example? So let's say you've set your timed content and then you want it to go off. You want the timed content to carry out its function once the timer hits 0. So you're setting your attribute ARIA hidden to true, but what you also need to do is set your attribute of ARIA live to off. So that means that the screen reader would no longer be detecting any live changes that would be happening to this content. So yeah, and then we have the issue of navigation. I think like my whole inspiration behind this talk was one time I was on this site and I was trying to scroll, and I don't know if you've ever gone to a site that does that thing that when you scroll a little bit, it like moves the rest of the page up by itself. So like I'm trying to scroll, but in the way my screen is, there was like some text at the bottom of the screen that I couldn't read. Like there was a whole paragraph at the bottom of the screen. But whenever I tried to scroll a little, it would just take me to the next section. So I had to like arguing with my phone just to read like one paragraph at the bottom of my screen. And basically, a lot of times when people implement these designs, you're not really thinking how people are going to use it. You're just thinking, oh, it's fast scrolling. It looks pretty. That's great. What about people who can't just scroll their screens fast? People who have to use like 2 fingers, because if you set your accessibility features on your phone, actually, you can't scroll like the regular way. You have to scroll and using more pressure anyway. So you don't really think of like, what you think is, oh, this is cool. It's a cool feature. It's a cool effect. But how does that thing actually translate to people who are using it? So that is the navigation aspect. How can you use JavaScript to improve the way people navigate through your sites? So this is basically how keyboard users would navigate through a site. So this is through tabbing. What tabbing does is that it goes to every element on the page that can have focus. So things like buttons or links or pretty much buttons and links, or any element where you set a focus on, that element can be tabbed to. So now, if you want to focus a custom element in JavaScript, and I do know that a lot of times we end up building custom elements because sometimes you cannot, especially with React applications, sometimes you can't get the element, like a native element that can do what you want. If you're trying to build a custom dropdown, for example, so a lot of times we end up building our custom elements. But then the catch is when you build a custom element, even if you set your ARIA roles and everything, you are missing out on a lot of the inbuilt native features. For example, if you have a button, you have your native button, like just your button tag, and now you have a div that you're setting to the role of button. The catch is that div can't be focused on because a div element is not focusable. So you're missing out on focus. That div can't be clicked on by itself unless you like properly put the listener there. So you're missing out on click. That div can't detect key presses. So the point is there are lots of native roles you're missing out on when you don't use native elements. But then what is like the alternative to that? How do we ensure that we don't really miss out on all these rules just because we want to use custom elements? Because sometimes you just don't have a choice. So the first thing you can do to make sure that the custom element you build has focus is to use a tab index. A tab index is what allows an element to be focused on. And what that means basically is that it adds it to the natural tabbing of the page. So if I set my tab index to 0, what that means is that wherever that element is going to follow the natural tabbing of the page. It's also possible that you want an element to be the first thing that people tab on when they reach a page. In that case, I could have a tab index of 1. As I'll show you in the next slide, sometimes you want to have like a skip to main content button. And in that case, you want it to be the first thing people tab on when they reach the page. So that's why you can give it a tab index of 1. Or sometimes you just don't want an item to be tabbed on at all. So let's say that I have hidden elements. So this happens sometimes. Let's say you have a sidebar, right? And you don't want that sidebar to be displayed until people click a certain button. So you set a transition property on your sidebar and you move it to like 100% off the screen. But the problem is because you did not set any attributes that are actually hiding that sidebar, if someone is tabbing through the site, at some point they're going to be able to tab to the elements in that sidebar, and it's just going to look like the outline or the cursor went missing for a while, or if there are like some scripts you need to implement when they open the sidebar, that's going to cause some errors for your page. So you also want to think about that. If you're hiding things in the page and you don't want them to receive focus, you set your tab index to -1. So what we have here is a skip to main content link. This is something very common among pages that have like a lot of navigation, for example. So you can see here I have like 10 links, and then I have the actual main content of the page. If I don't want people to have to tab through all 10 links, and that's just like a random number, it could be like 100 links or whatever, or like 50 images before you can get to the actual content. If I want people to be able to just get to the main content of the page, the best thing to do is include a skip to main content. So like I said in the last slide, you would just give your skip to main content a tab index of 1. So it is the first thing people tab on the page, and then maybe you could include like a CSS property to make it display when it gets focused, basically. So what I have here is my skip button, and then I have my main section. So basically what I'm doing is that once you click the skip to main content of the page, it gives the main section focus. What that means is that I have clicked the main skip to main content. It's taking me to the main content immediately. It's not going to have to make me tab through all those links before I can get to the main content. So it's just really useful for making sure that you handle updating focus in a way that is useful to people, because people who are scrolling through their keyboards or people who rely on screen readers don't just have the option of like, just scrolling really fast and moving past all those images you've created. So you need to keep that in mind as well. And then another option you can have in your page is something called autofocus. So this kind of works like, let's say you have a list of items on the page, and the first thing you want people to do when they get to that page is to be able to search through these items. You could have a search bar in your page, and what you want to do is basically once that page loads, just focus on the search bar automatically. What that means is that they don't have to tab through the entire page to get to the search bar first. They can just like start typing in the search bar the minute the page loads. So this I think like autofocusing, it does have a bit of like a debate behind it, because like on the one hand you want to take away the user control. Like what if they don't actually want the searching to be the first thing? Also, what if there are links before that they wanted to get to before getting to the search bar? But it's one of those like give and take things. It applies to the situation. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. And then updating focus. This is another very important thing, because a lot of times people don't do this. If you have a modal on your page, or if you have anything that's going to be a pop-up, or anything that's going to be on top of other elements in your page, you want to make sure that that thing actually gets focused once it's rendered. For example, if I'm tabbing through a page and I click a button that displays a modal or a pop-up, but then because you have not set focus on that pop-up, what that means, I'm going to have to keep on tabbing to the page until I'm able to reach that pop-up, because that is how tabbing works. It goes in the order of which your elements are listed, so you can't just like jump to a new element just because it was placed on the page. So you have to make sure that whenever you introduce anything to the screen that you want people to be able to use automatically, you want to make sure that you put focus on that screen. Imagine if you had like a modal, but then for some reason the modal was at the bottom of the screen. So even when people popped up the modal, they still had to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the screen. That's basically much the same thing as not putting focus on the things. So yeah, once you open your modal or whatever, you set your style, you can just literally set your focus property and then also set your area hidden properties. And the thing you want to do is hide the previous property. Hide the previous, let's say the previous element, for example. If I am putting a modal on the page, what I want is that the rest of the page should be hidden to the screen reader. Oh, that was a typo. That should say modal set attributes area hidden false. Yeah, so the modal should no longer be hidden, but the main page should be hidden. So I'm setting the main page area hidden property to true. So that means that people won't see the content of that. The screen reader won't, it basically won't see the content of that main page anymore. So yeah. And then finally, we have the interaction aspect. What this means is basically how people are able to interact with your site. A lot of times JavaScript is written for functionality purposes. That means you want people to be able to click on things. You want effects to be able to happen. So are you making sure that everyone can interact with your site in the same way, regardless of what technologies or what abilities they have? I forgot I put that GIF there. I just thought it was so funny because it's like the cat is interacting with the sites. So yeah, is your site cat accessible? If a cat was going on your JavaScript site, would they be able to access it? That's a very important question. So yes, the most important thing when it comes to interaction is the handler events. A lot of times you create an element and then you put your little on-click property, and you think it's fine because yeah, I can click this element now. What about people who don't use mouses? People who are tabbing through your site, people who are using screen readers and they just want to press a button, enter, or they just want to press tabs, open a drop down, or they just want to press spacebar, or they want to submit a form without having to tab all the way to the submit button. Are you including enough handler events to make sure that people can access your sites in the same way, regardless of which technologies they're using? I like to think of it as like Newton's second law of accessibility. For every mouse event, there must be an equal and accurate keyboard event. Just think of that. Whenever you create a on-click event, are you also creating an on-key press event or an on-key down event or yada yada yada? So it's actually just really easy to implement. It's not, you don't even need to do anything more special. You just need to like call the function, detects the key that has been pressed, this which is basically saying if the enter key is pressed, and then I'm just calling the handle click function. So if they press the enter button, it's going to do the same thing in my handle click function. So it's actually really easy. And yeah, that is about it for the ways we can write accessible JavaScript. There are actually a bunch more ways, let's say, specific ways, and there are some cases which I've listed at the end of this site in a bunch of lists and links of resources. But for now, we're going to move on to the testing for accessibility aspect. So if you've written your code and you think it's fine, but how do you actually know if this thing you've written is accessible? The first way you can test for accessibility in your site is to manually test it. Go to your site, tab through it. Does any hidden content get focused? Is there any point where your focusing outline gets lost in the page and you can't tell what point it's on? Because sometimes people remove the outline from their page. And what that means is basically, even if I'm focusing on elements, I'm not going to know which elements I'm focusing on. Or also, if you have hidden elements that is somewhere off the page, but that element is still getting focus, you are going to lose that outline of your page. So yeah, is there anything which is mouse operable which does not get keyboard focus? What that means is, are there any buttons that should be able to be clicked, or any buttons that should be able to, or any elements that should be able to interacted with, like a drop-down toggle or selecting options in a list that does not get keyboard focus? So I cannot tab to those elements, for example. I can only click them with the mouse. Are there any custom controls or widgets that cannot be operated with keyboard only use? Are there any custom components you're creating that people can't use the keyboard to navigate? I can't press enter to click your button, or I can't tab to scroll through a list of drop downs. So these are manual tests you can think of when you're going through your page. And that thing I like to do is I like to go to a page. If you created a page, just go to it, and on the body tag, just set an opacity of 0, so that'll just make your page blank. And then literally just like turn on the screen reader. The one I use is Chromebox. Turn on the screen reader in your browser and just tab through the page and see if it actually makes sense. See if you can understand what parts of the page you're on, or if you can navigate through the page easily. That's it for manual testing. Some accessibility testing tools you can use are there's the web accessibility evaluation tool. It's just a site where you can go and enter the URL of the site you want to test for accessibility. And it basically gives you a report on like the structure and the design. And then it suggests like how you can fix stuff and how you can, repair stuff. Because fix and repair are different words. And Lighthouse is the Chrome extension. So literally, if you just go to your Chrome, I think around where you have searches and stuff, you can just go to Lighthouse and it will generate an audit for you with like your performance and your SEO and your, I think, best practices or something, and accessibility. And it just gives you a score and it tells you what you've done wrong or what you've done right and what you can test for by yourself. Chromevox is a screen reader. In the Chrome browser, you can use like whatever screen reader comes with your browser. It's just basically helpful for knowing how people who don't use, let's say, mouses, for example, would use your site. And then ally.js, that's A11y.js. It's a really cool light JavaScript framework library that helps you create, how does it work? It like creates custom elements and helps you like fix all those focus issues or keyboard handler issues that you may run into when you're creating your own custom elements. Another thing I forgot to include here is the Web Accessibility Visual Studio Code extension. If you just go to the Visual Studio Code marketplace and you type in like accessibility, I think web accessibility, it'll pop up and it will show you an extension. It's really cool for when you're writing code. It lets you know where you can use a semantic element or if a rule is missing from a generic element that you're using. So yeah, those are some tools you can try out. And then these are the resources for this talk. I did have a demo, which I'm not going to run. But if you do want to see the demo, though, you can go to that site there, jemima.github.io/accessible-js, and you should be able to see the demo right there. I also have the source code for that site on my GitHub, github.com/jemima.accessible-js. And if you want access to these slides, you can go to my website, jemima.com/slides/accessible-js, and you should be able to get access to it and all that. I have a list of articles you can check out in case you want to read up more on accessibility with JavaScript. These are really great. There's Writing JavaScript with Accessibility in Mind by Manuel. He talks about, it's just a really cool article. He explains like how the focusing works and how you should be polite to your users when you're updating content in a page. There's Accessible JavaScript, an overview of Accessible JavaScript, the best practices for accessibility, how accessibility taught me to build JavaScript, all really great articles on understanding the importance and how JavaScript can aid accessibility. And there's also the WAI ARIA authoring practices. This is a very helpful tool because it's basically like think of it as a dictionary for elements. So, sometimes you're trying to create a custom element and you don't know which role belongs to what, or you don't know what other properties it could need. That's basically what that link is. It's basically just telling you that this is the element, these are the roles it needs. So if you're trying to create the custom element, these are all the things you're going to need to put inside that element. So yeah, it's really great. That's about it for me. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, I'll be taking them after the Q&A. But if you just want to talk, like outside this, regarding this talk, you could, I have like a contact form on my website. You could just send me a message there, or you can reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn and, just like let me know what you thought, or if you have any questions or you just want to discuss some more on accessibility, I would love to connect with you. Yeah, that's about it from me. Bye. Hi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If anyone's got any questions for Jemima, please add them now to the Q&A tab, and we shall ask away. The thing that really, when you said it, I wrote it down straight away. The web is for everyone, so everyone should be able to use it. I did like that, Jemima. I think that's sums it up very well.
Yeah, I can't take credit for that. That's not actually my quote. I just can't remember. I think it was from like the creator of the web himself, actually. It's like I just can't remember.
I was thinking it could be a Tim Berners-Lee thing. I couldn't tell if he's modified it, but yeah, it might just be a straight quote from him.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It's from Tim Berners-Lee. But what he said is everyone, and then I guess I add tact on the so everyone can be able to use it. But
yeah, I like it.
Look at me. Paraphrase.
Very good. All right, we've got a question in. do you have any advice on where to put skip to content link? Should it be the first thing tabbed to if using a keyboard, or after the navigation or elsewhere?
Yeah, it should definitely be the first thing tabbed to if using a keyboard, because basically what you're trying to say is that you're trying to let them skip to the main content. So you don't want them to have to go through your entire navigation before they can then skip to main content. So yeah, it should be literally the first thing on your page. You can just hide it somewhere up with like CSS, and then if it gets focus, then you scroll, you just slide it into view and let people skip to the main content. So, yeah.
Makes sense. Very good. Okay. Is there an easy way to handle focus when a component like a model is destroyed?
Yeah, so I think in the slide I did mention that you can set ARIA heading to true and then ARIA heading to false for the main page, and then you can put a focus element on the modal itself. So there is this method. It's basically a way of getting the last active element. So what you want to do is, honestly, Manuel did go into this in detail in the link in his article, right? You can check that out. But also what you want to do is you have a variable that's basically like last focus, and before the modal is open, you can just set like document.active element. What that is going to do is that it's going to select whichever element was the last thing that was focused on that page, and then once you close the element, you just want to put last focus back in focus. So that's pretty much how it works.
Makes sense. Okay, we've got one here with 2 votes for it. It's a very popular question. Do you have any advice on how to get stakeholders on board with accessibility? Team or stakeholders on board with accessibility? So,
I get this a lot because it's such a thing, like you're trying to build a site and you're trying to make sure it's accessible, but then the PM or like whoever is in charge is just like, yeah, we don't need all that. Just like ship it. We just need the product. And the thing is, like I said, I feel that's the reason why I did show that there are actual legal ramifications to not making sure your site's accessible. So I feel like that is one way to like kind of get them on board with you taking more time to make things accessible. You point out that they could be in breach of a lawsuit. You point out that it's kind of negative PR if people can't use your site. And then also there are a lot of business benefits for it. It gives you higher SEO if your site is more accessible. So that's good for the business case. It's also just like you have like higher user retention. You're not as open to lawsuits. Basically just like structure it in a business way, like come at it from the business aspect, not so much the decency aspect. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we've got great presentation. My question, if content becomes accessible to humans, does it mean the content will also be fully semantically visible for crawlers in search? That's a nice question.
That's a funny question. What do you mean accessible to humans?
I guess they're saying, but maybe more accessible to human beings. Is it more visible in that?
Well, okay, yes, in that case, yes. That is because crawlers basically, which is kind of brings back to my point on SEO. Whenever, let's say, you're going through the site for like indexing purposes on like a search result or something, sites that have proper structure, sites that have semantic properly labeled images, they have alt tags where they need alt tags, so they have captions, they end up having higher SEO values than sites that don't have all these things. If the structure of your site is out of place, or if you don't use as many semantic elements, you're actually losing SEO points. Let's think of it like that. So yes, when you make your content fully accessible, I guess it would be more visible to the crawlers. Yes, it's also good for like indexing purposes and stuff.
Yeah, generally it's good practice, isn't it? And you get the from doing the right thing, because that's
exactly
the right thing by the standards and things. So yeah, okay, that's good. Is there an easy way to handle focus when a component like a model is destroyed? We've already done that one, haven't we?
Yeah, I think we've already done that one.
I think we have. I think that might be all of them. Is there any other questions?
Okay, great. Tick, 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 tick.
No, I think that's all of it. Well, Jemima,
all right.
That was a really good talk. I think you're around for a while if anyone else wants to talk to you, aren't you?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
You've been in remote for a little while if anyone wants to talk to you, are you?
Yeah, they did. Minutes ago, so actually I have to go pick it up. But I will be back in like 10 minutes. So if anyone does want to talk, or you could just hit me up on Twitter or whatever, and I'd be glad to talk with you there.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I won't ask what.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you so much for tuning in and for the questions. Bye.
Bye-bye.